Greetings, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky, following negotiations in Berlin with American Representatives Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, announced that Ukraine does not intend to recognize Donbas as Russian, neither de facto nor de jure. Zelensky made this statement against the backdrop of reports that the United States continues to pressure Ukraine to renounce control over that part of the Donetsk region which is currently controlled by the legitimate Ukrainian government. Zelensky explained these divergences as follows: Ukraine does not intend to give up and recognize Donbas as Russian, Russia wishes to take the entire Donbas, and the United States is seeking a compromise. However, Volodymyr Zelensky emphasized that if we are talking about the creation of some sort of free economic zone, this does not mean that such territory must be under Russian control. And, as far as can be understood, it is precisely from the perspective of what the part of the Donetsk region currently controlled by Ukrainian troops will look like that the main negotiations between Kiev and Washington are taking place. Regarding this issue, representatives of the United States and Ukraine will be speaking in Miami this weekend. But the question arises, to what extent is Russia willing to agree to any proposal that does not include the factual and juridical recognition of the Donetsk region as a subject of the Russian Federation by both Ukraine and the United States? And will Putin not take advantage of the opportunity to refuse any further negotiations on ending the war, motivating this by the fact that he is not being given the Donbas? However, in the White House asterisk, they not only underscore the necessity of Ukraine transferring control over Donbas but also link this to the provision of security guarantees, the level of which increases with every round of Ukrainian-American negotiations. Now they are even speaking of legally binding security guarantees, which would include the possibility of United States intervention in the conflict in the event of a repeated attack by Russia on Ukraine. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk emphasized that this is the first time Americans have spoken about the possibility of their own intervention. As, by the way, it is the first time there is talk that these could be legally binding guarantees ratified by the U.S. Congress, and which, therefore, would not depend on the term of office of U.S. President Donald Trump in the White House. But here, several quite important questions arise. Americans link this not only to Ukraine's refusal to control part of the territory of the Donetsk region but, at the same time, to the non-accession of Ukraine to NATO. Moreover, the United States intends to independently block this accession. But we understand perfectly well that the so-called security concerns of the Russian Federation, non-existent concerns, are connected precisely with the attempt to keep their hands free for further aggression against Ukraine or any other former Soviet republic. And indeed, if Ukraine or any other former Soviet republic joins the North Atlantic Alliance, in this case, Russia has no, well, if not the possibility of an attack, then at least this attack creates real grounds for a conflict between the Russian Federation and NATO member countries, specifically with the United States. I would say, primarily with the United States. And when the United States, with one hand, blocks Ukraine's entry into NATO, and with the other, proposes to Ukraine legally binding guarantees that foresee their own intervention in the event of a new Russian attack on Ukraine, this creates serious problems for Putin. Because formally, it destroys all his security concerns, but practically, it does not give him and his successors in the post of President of the Russian Federation the ability to view the possibilities of armed attack on Ukraine for the annexation of the territory of a neighboring state to the Russian Federation and the restoration of Russian statehood within the borders of the Soviet Union of 1991, which is the main foreign policy goal of Russia since the 90s of the last century. Then a quite simple question arises: why should Putin agree to such terms of a peace agreement, even if they are proposed by Donald Trump? And even if the United States and Ukraine agree to such conditions. Thus, we again find ourselves in the situation we were in before the start of these peace talks. The main theme of this process remains, as we see, the real desire of the United States to reach an agreement primarily with Ukraine and European countries, and to work out a joint position that can be represented to the Russian Federation. However, no one continues to conduct such detailed negotiations with the Russian Federation itself. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner reported that if this is necessary, they could again travel to the Russian capital and hold negotiations with Putin and his closest associates. However, The fact that real negotiations regarding the end of the war are possible only in a situation where they take place with Moscow and Kiev simultaneously is absolutely obvious. And they definitely should not be connected exclusively with unilateral pressure on Ukraine. Meanwhile, we do not see any real pressure on Russia, aside from the introduction of new sanctions against the Russian Federation. We just see a hope that the United States, together with Ukraine and European partners, will be able to work out such optimal conditions for ending the war that they can then present to the President of the Russian Federation. What will happen if the President of the Russian Federation rejects these conditions, which is an absolutely realistic scenario for the development of events, we do not yet understand. And we may find ourselves in a situation where all conditions are agreed upon, and the Russian Federation rejects the peace plan for the sake of continuing this long war. And thus it turns out that we are discussing not so much guarantees from the United States regarding Ukrainian security, not so much even what the control over the territory of the Donetsk region, which is currently under the control of the legitimate Ukrainian government and the defense forces of Ukraine, will look like, as much as the attempt not to quarrel with the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and his associates, who continue to be participants in the peace process. And this desire to preserve the United States as an ally of Ukraine and Europe seems to be the main theme of the negotiations we are observing. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it, subscribe to my social networks, to the channel on Patreon and buy me a coffee, which help develop these resources. Use the sponsorship function on YouTube itself. Victory and peace to you. Good luck.